The October wind off the Bighorn foothills carried the kind of cold that reached past wool and skin and settled in the marrow. And Cassian Bridger walked the gravel shoulder of Highway 14 with both hands buried deep in the pockets of a faded olive field jacket and his German shepherd, Tenny, patting silently at his left heel. He had not eaten since a half cup of black coffee and a heel of bread at a truck stop the morning before, and the $11 he had folded into the lining of his right boot were the last $11 he intended to spend on himself for as long as he could stretch them. A lifted black pickup blasted past in the eastbound lane, the driver leaning on the horn for sport, and a spray of gravel stung Cassian's cheek and bounced off Tenny's shoulder. The dog did not flinch. He had stopped flinching at unkind men a long time ago. Cassian stopped just long enough to spit into the ditch and watch the truck shrink toward the horizon. Then he hitched his pack higher on his shoulders and kept walking. The road bent north past a stand of leaning aspens whose leaves had gone the color of beaten copper, and the sun was just beginning to fall behind the western ridges. He had been told by a kind woman 2 towns back that there was an old roadside diner about 9 miles up the highway where they would sometimes let you sweep the parking lot in exchange for a bowl of soup. 9 miles was nothing to a man who had crossed the Hindu Kush on foot, but his left leg, the one that had taken the shrapnel outside Marib in 2015, was beginning to drag in a way that told him the cold had reached the metal pin and was working on his patience. He thought, as he often did, about how a man can be a Navy SEAL one year and a sleeping shape under a tarp the next, and how the distance between the two looked like a lifetime to other people. But to him it had felt like the slow draining of a single afternoon. Tenny made a small sound that was not quite a whine, and Cassian stopped. The dog had his head low and his ears forward, and his amber eyes were fixed on something in the gravel turnout where the highway crested a small rise and dropped away toward Crow Creek. Cassian followed the line of the dog's stare and saw, against the weathered cedar of an old fence post, the slumped shape of a man, face down in the dead grass. He told himself, in the way that walking men have told themselves 1,000 times across 1,000 cold roads, that he had every reason to keep walking. He told himself there were sheriff's deputies who took a check from the county for exactly this sort of thing. He told himself the $11 in his boot would not feed 2 mouths and a dog. He told himself all of it. And then he stepped off the shoulder and walked into the grass. The man was old and small, and so still that Cassian thought for the first 10 seconds he had walked up on a corpse. He went to one knee in the dry weeds and pressed 2 fingers to the cold, bristled skin under the man's jaw. And the pulse was there, weak and slow as a tap from a leaking pipe. Tenny pressed his black nose into the man's coat and breathed out a long, warm breath that fogged in the air. The man wore a brown corduroy coat gone soft, with use over a wool-plaid shirt buttoned wrong, and his trousers had been mended at the knee with a square of denim that did not match. His silver-white hair was combed back from a forehead deeply lined, and a pair of thick wire-rimmed glasses had fallen into the grass near his right hand. Cassian gathered them up and slid them into his jacket pocket. He turned the man as gently as he could, and as the corduroy coat shifted, he saw the gauntness of the cheekbones and the pale blue eyes, half open and fixed on a sky the man could not see. There was no wallet in any of the pockets that Cassian dared to check. There was a hand-stitched piece of paper, folded small, with a name on it. He did not unfold it. He did not have the right. He sat back on his heels and looked at Tenny, and Tenny looked at him with the kind of steady waiting that the dog had learned across 2 deployments and 4 winters of being fed last. Cassian thought, for 1 second longer than he had thought about anything in months, of a Yemeni village south of Marib in 2015, and of a man older than this one whom Cassian had not reached fast enough. He let the memory stand there in the cold beside him, and then he took off his pack and unstrapped the bedroll, and he wrapped the old man in his only spare blanket, and he lifted him up over his shoulder in the slow, careful fireman's carry he had taught to 2 classes of new boots in Coronado, and he started walking north up Highway 14 with Tenny on his left and the wind on his right and the sun gone behind the ridges. The miles that followed were the kind a man does not remember in particular detail afterward, but only as a long wait and a long cold and a slow, steady prayer he would not have called a prayer if anyone had asked him. The old man weighed less than a deer. Twice he murmured something that was not quite a word, and Cassian shifted him on his shoulder and answered, low and steady, the way he had answered men in stretchers 100 times, in places he no longer named out loud. About 4 miles up the highway, when the sky had gone the deep bruised blue of full evening, and the first hard stars had pricked through, Cassian saw the sign for old Bert's roadside diner glowing yellow against the dusk, and he made for it the way a swimmer makes for a buoy. The bell over the door clanged a tinny clang as he kicked the door open with his boot, and the woman behind the counter dropped a coffee pot. The pot did not break. It clattered onto the rubber mat by her feet, and she did not look down to see whether it had survived. She looked at the old man slung across the broad shoulders of the gaunt, unshaven stranger in the door, and the German shepherd standing at his heel, and she said, in the way that people say things when their breath has just been knocked sideways, "Oh, good Lord," and then she came around the counter at a half run. Her name, written on a brass pin over her left breast pocket, was Marlene Pruitt, and the cook in the back, a heavy man with a flour-dusted apron, was already on the wall phone. Cassian eased the old man down into the back booth, the one against the radiator, and Marlene was there beside him with a folded apron and a pillow she pulled off her own stool, and she had a glass of water at the man's lips before Cassian had even straightened up. The cook said, on the phone, "Yes, ma'am, an elderly gentleman. No, we don't know. Yes, yes, send them." And Cassian, who had not spoken since the gravel turnout, said, "Hold off the deputies, please. Hold off until he wakes." The cook covered the receiver with one heavy hand and looked at Marlene, and Marlene looked at the old man. And the old man's pale blue eyes opened a slow inch, and his lips moved, and he said, "No police, no hospital, no kin. Please?" The room went very quiet for a long second. The fluorescent tube over the counter buzzed. Marlene put her hand on the old man's hand. The cook said into the phone, "Ma'am, false alarm. Just a fainting spell. We got him. Thank you." And he hung up the receiver and looked at Cassian with an expression that was neither approval nor disapproval, but the careful blankness of a man who had run a roadside diner long enough to know that some stories did not need a deputy in them. Cassian sat down across from the old man in the booth, and Tenny lay down between his boots, and Marlene brought a bowl of beef stew the size of a man's 2-cupped hands and set it down in front of the old man. And Cassian reached into his boot and pulled out the $11 folded inside the lining, and he laid it on the table. Marlene looked at the $11 and said, "Son, put that back." "Put." Cassian said, "Ma'am, he eats and the dog eats and I'll take a coffee." She said, "Son." He said, "Ma'am." She said, "Fine then." And she took 6 of the $11 and she pushed the other 5 back across the table with the flat of her hand. And she said, "There's a saucer of ground beef coming for the dog on the house, because the dog and I have an understanding." Tenny lifted his head and looked at her, and his tail thumped once against the floor. The old man ate the stew in slow, patient spoonfuls with both hands wrapped around the bowl, as if it were a small fire. Cassian drank his coffee black. Out the window, the headlights of 1 or 2 cars came and went on Highway 14, and the wind rattled the screen door in its frame. After a while, the old man set the spoon down, and he wiped his mouth with the back of his wrist, and he said, in a voice so quiet that Cassian had to lean across the booth to hear him, "Son, would you take me home?" Cassian said, "Sir, where is home?" The old man's pale blue eyes closed for a moment, as though the question itself was something to be balanced. He said, "2 valleys over, past the old pump station on the Painted Rock Road, the Whitcomb place. There's no one there, just me. I just need to get home." Marlene came over with the coffee pot and topped Cassian's mug, and she heard the answer, and she said, "Sir, that road's closed for winter starting yesterday. The county dropped the gate on the lower switchback." The old man's lips trembled. he said, "then I'll never see home again." Cassian looked at the old man, and at the dog, and at the door, and at the wind beyond the door. And he drank the rest of his coffee in one long swallow that scalded his throat and made him not quite able to speak for a moment. And then he said, "Sir, you'll see home." Marlene said, "Son, listen." He said, "Ma'am." She said, "Son, the cross-country way is 22 miles through the painted rock drainage, and the snow's already in the high passes." He said, "Ma'am." She said, "Son, he weighs nothing, but you weigh not much more. And that dog needs feeding, and you need feeding, and 22 miles is not nothing." He said, "Ma'am, I appreciate it." And she looked at him a long moment, the way a woman who has run a roadside diner for 31 years looks at a man whose mind is already 2 valleys over. And then she went into the back, and she came out 5 minutes later with a brown paper bag full of biscuits wrapped in wax paper and a steel thermos of black coffee and a tin of dog kibble that the cook kept for the strays, and she pressed all of it into Cassian's pack, and she would not let him refuse. The cook came out of the kitchen wiping his big hands on the apron, and he said, "Son, you take the back trail behind the diner up to the old logging road, and you stay west of the creek till you hit the burn scar, and then you cut north to the saddle. The county doesn't gate that road." The cook's name, Cassian learned later, was Bertram Quill, and the diner had been his father's before him. Cassian slid the napkin Marlene had given him across the table, and he took the pen from the bracket on the counter, and he wrote his name in plain block capitals, Cassian Bridger, and he set the napkin in front of the old man. The old man took the napkin in his trembling thin fingers, and he folded it twice, very slowly, very carefully, and he slid it into the inside pocket of the brown corduroy coat, and he buttoned the pocket shut. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Cassian helped him to his feet, and Marlene wrapped a wool scarf of her own around the old man's neck and would not be argued with. And Tenny stood and shook himself, and the bell over the door clanged its tinny clang, and the 3 of them stepped out of the warm fluorescent glow of old Bert's roadside diner into the dark of a Montana October night, and they walked together up the back trail behind the diner toward the old logging road. Behind them, through the diner window, Marlene Pruitt stood with her hand pressed against the glass and watched until the dark took them, and the cook came up beside her and laid his big floury hand on her shoulder, and neither of them said a word. They climbed the back trail in the dark, and the moon came up late and thin and gave them just enough light to read the ground, and Cassian carried the old man piggyback for the steeper switchbacks and walked beside him on the level stretches with one arm under the old man's elbow. Tenny moved ahead of them and behind them and back again, scouting the way a working dog scouts a thing that is his to keep, and twice he stopped at the edge of a shadow that turned out to be a coyote, and once at a shadow that turned out to be a bull elk standing very still beside a stand of lodgepole pine. They camped the first night in the lee of a granite outcropping just inside the burn scar, where the standing dead of the old fire reached up like blackened fingers against a sky pricked through with the cold, sharp stars of the high country. Cassian gathered fallen wood, and Tenny lay down with his back against the old man and warmed him through the wool scarf, and Cassian boiled creek water in a tin cup and softened a biscuit in it for the old man, and gave the rest to the dog and ate one biscuit himself and called it a meal. The old man slept curled like a child against Tenny's flank with the dog's tail draped over his thin legs, and Cassian sat up against the granite and watched the burn scar in the starlight and did not sleep. Toward the end of the night, when the cold had bitten deep enough that even the dog was shifting in his sleep, the old man opened his pale blue eyes and looked at Cassian across the embers and said, very quietly, "Son, you have a name." Cassian said, "Sir, you read it on the napkin." The old man said, "I read it." Cassian said, "Sir," the old man said, "I had a daughter once." Cassian did not say anything. The old man said, "I lost her over a quarrel I cannot even properly remember anymore. I think I was right, and I think I was also a fool. The two are not exclusive in a man my age." Cassian said, "No, sir, they are not." The old man said, "Do you know what the worst thing is, son?" Cassian said, "No, sir." The old man said, "The worst thing is when you have lived your whole life believing that the door is open if she ever decides to come back through it, and one morning you wake up and you understand that the door has been shut for years and you were the one who shut it and you did not even feel the latch close." Cassian watched the embers a long while. He said, "Sir, I had a man under me in 2015. He was older than you. We took a building in a Yemeni village south of Marib. The building was not what we had been told it was. He was inside. I was second through the door. I was not fast enough. The old man said, 'Son.' Cassian said, 'Sir, I have walked 7 winters since then, and there has not been a single day I have not seen his face when I close my eyes at night.' The old man said, 'Son.' Cassian said, 'I think a man does not get to set down what he has not yet been forgiven for.' The old man said, 'Son, you are going to set it down, whether you want to or not. The pile is too heavy and the road is too long. You set it down, or it sets you down.' Cassian did not answer. The old man closed his eyes and reached out one trembling thin hand and laid it across Tenny's flank, and Tenny exhaled a long, warm breath, and the old man slept again. The second day was the hardest. A cold front rolled in over the saddle out of Canada before noon, and the temperature fell 10 degrees in an hour, and the wind picked up off the high country and carried hard pellets of snow that stung the cheek and the eye. Cassian's left leg, the one with the pin, began to drag in earnest. He cut a stout walking stick from the dead branch of a lodgepole and leaned hard on it and kept walking. The old man insisted on walking himself for the first 3 miles of the morning, and Cassian let him, and Tenny walked between them like a small black and tan bridge, and they crossed the upper meadow in single file with the snow pellets ticking against the brims of their hats. At the crossing of the south fork of Crow Creek, the old man's foot turned on a wet stone, and he went down sideways into the cold, ankle-deep water before Cassian could catch him. He came up, gasping, with the corduroy coat soaked through to the wool-plaid shirt, and Cassian carried him out of the creek with one arm and laid him under the lee of a great fallen ponderosa, and he stripped the soaked corduroy off the trembling thin shoulders, and he peeled off his own gray wool flannel shirt and his only spare gray wool undershirt from the bottom of his pack, and he wrapped the old man in both layers and slid him back into the corduroy coat with the flannel shirt buttoned up to his thin neck. Tenny lay across the old man's lap and breathed warm into his face. Cassian zipped his olive field jacket up tight under his chin against the cold and walked the rest of that day with only canvas and lining between him and the wind. And he did not say a word about it because there was nothing about it to be said. The old man wept silently for an hour after that and would not look at Cassian's face. Cassian did not push him. He walked beside him with one hand at his elbow and Tenny in front, and the snow falling now in proper flakes the size of small coins. They camped the second night in a shallow rock alcove the cook had told them about, and Cassian built the fire bigger than he should have because the old man was shivering in a way that frightened him, and he warmed creek water and softened the last of the biscuits and fed the old man like a child by the orange firelight, and the old man took every bite with both his trembling thin hands wrapped around Cassian's wrist as if to anchor himself to the act of being kept alive. After the old man slept, Tenny crawled across the firelight and laid himself across Cassian's bare cold torso under the open field jacket, and Cassian wrapped his arms around the dog's dense warm coat and pressed his face into the black and tan saddle of fur at the dog's shoulder, and he wept once, a single hot wet sound that he had not made in 7 winters, and Tenny did not move and did not flinch, and only breathed his long warm breaths against the hollow of Cassian's throat. The third day broke clear and bitter. The snow had stopped in the night and lay 6 inches deep in the open meadow and a foot deep in the drifts against the lee of the rocks, and the sky was the hard pale blue of a high country morning in early winter. They came up out of the burn scar a little before noon, and they crested the saddle a little before 2, and Cassian set the old man down on a flat stone, and wiped his own face with the back of his hand, and pointed and said, "Sir, is that home?" The old man followed Cassian's pointed finger across the lower meadow, and down the long slope into a wide brown bowl of hayfields gone to stubble. And at the far end of the bowl, set against a windbreak of cottonwoods, stood a crooked 2-story farmhouse painted long ago in a white that had faded to the color of an old tooth, with a leaning red barn beside it, and a weathered grain silo behind, and a long, curving gravel drive running out to a rural mailbox where the painted rock road came up from the south. The old man looked at the farmhouse for a long time. His pale blue eyes filled. He said, "Son, that is home." Cassian said, "Sir, then we go down." They went down. It took another 2 hours because the old man could not walk faster than a slow shuffle in the snow, and at the bottom of the slope where the meadow met the long, curving drive, Cassian gathered him up one last time and carried him on his back the final quarter-mile, because the old man's strength had run out in earnest. Tenny walked alongside with his head low and his ears forward, and the white farmhouse grew larger and larger against the windbreak of cottonwoods, and the wind out of the bowl smelled of cold hay and old wood and wood smoke from a stovepipe that no longer drew. The porch steps were 3 weathered planks gone soft at the edges. Cassian set the old man down at the foot of the steps and steadied him with one arm, and the old man drew himself up to his full height of 5 feet 7 inches, and put one trembling thin hand on the porch rail, and he climbed those 3 steps under his own power, because he had decided, somewhere on the long slope down, that he would not be carried into his own home. Tenny climbed the steps behind him. Cassian followed. At the front door, which was unlocked because there was no one within 20 miles to lock it against, the old man turned and took Cassian's right hand in both of his trembling thin hands. His pale blue eyes were wet and very steady. He said, "Son." Cassian said, "Sir." The old man said, "I will not forget you. I want you to know that." Cassian said, "Sir, be well." The old man reached into the inside pocket of the brown corduroy coat and brought out a small thing that flashed dull in the gray afternoon light. A tin button worn smooth at the edges, with a faint impression of an eagle on its face. He pressed the tin button into Cassian's palm. He said, "Son, this was my brother's. He died at Incheon in 1950. He was the only family I ever loved who loved me back without complication. I am giving him to you because I have no one else to give him to, and because I want him to walk the rest of the road with a man I trust." Cassian looked down at the tin button in his rough, calloused palm. He folded the old man's trembling thin fingers over it and pressed his fingers gently shut. He said, "Sir, you keep him." He said, "Sir, I have walked a long road already, and I will walk further, and your brother belongs at this farmhouse with you." The old man's wet, pale blue eyes searched Cassian's face for a long moment, and then he nodded once, slowly, and he tucked the tin button back into his coat pocket, and he buttoned the pocket shut, and he stepped through the front door of the white farmhouse, and Tenny followed him as far as the threshold and stopped. Cassian helped the old man to a wingback chair by a cold wood stove in the front parlor, and he laid the wool scarf and the corduroy coat across a side table, and he took the pot off the stove and went out to the well, and worked the iron pump handle until the cold, deep water ran clear, and he filled the pot, and he came back and laid kindling and birch bark in the stove and lit it with a match from a tin on the mantel, and he set the pot on the stove to heat. He found a tin of stew in the pantry, and a half-loaf of dry bread and a wedge of cheddar wrapped in wax paper, and he warmed the stew and softened the bread in the broth, and laid it all on a wooden tray on the side table beside the wingback chair, and the old man ate slowly with one trembling thin hand, and watched Cassian move around the parlor with his pale blue eyes very still. When the old man had finished eating, Cassian helped him to the small bedroom at the back of the parlor and laid him down on a bed made up with a faded patchwork quilt that smelled of cedar and old lavender, and he tucked the quilt up under the old man's thin chin, and Tenny lay down on the rag rug by the bed and laid his black and tan head down on his paws. The old man's pale blue eyes followed Cassian's shape moving back across the parlor toward the stove. He said, "Son?" Cassian said, "Sir?" The old man said, "Will you stay until morning?" Cassian said, "Sir, I will stay until morning." The old man closed his eyes and slept. Cassian sat in the wing-back chair by the stove and listened to the slow, rhythmic breathing of the old man and the slow, rhythmic breathing of the dog, and he watched the orange firelight move on the worn floorboards and the faded wallpaper. And he counted, in a voice in his head that he had not used in 7 winters, all the things that had brought him to this front parlor on this October afternoon. He did not sleep. About an hour before dawn, when the sky outside the windows had begun to take on the very faint gunmetal gray of the coming morning, he got up out of the wing-back chair and he laid 2 more pieces of cordwood in the stove, and he set a fresh pot of water on to heat for when the old man woke. He stood for a long time in the doorway of the back bedroom and watched the old man sleep. He stood for a long time looking at Tenny on the rag rug, who looked back at him with one amber eye half open and did not move and did not protest. He went to the kitchen and he wrote on the back of an envelope he found by the bread tin a single line in plain block capitals that said, "Sir, you are home now." He laid the envelope on the side table by the wing-back chair where the old man would see it when he woke. He went out the front door and closed it gently behind him and stepped down off the porch into the gray morning. And Tenny came across the parlor and out the front door and stood on the porch behind him with his amber eyes asking the question that working dogs ask. And Cassian crouched and laid his rough, calloused hand against the dog's broad, warm head and said, "No, boy, come on." And Tenny followed him down the porch steps and out across the snowy hayfield bowl and up the long slope toward the saddle. And Cassian did not look back at the white farmhouse, not once, because he knew that if he looked back, he would not be able to keep walking, and the cold wind out of the saddle dried the wetness on his cheeks before he was halfway up the slope. The years that came after Cassian Bridger walked away from that white farmhouse were the years he had always been walking, and they did not feel different in their texture from the years that had come before. He drifted south through the Bighorn foothills into Wyoming, and he took seasonal work where he could find it, and he asked no questions of any man who hired him and gave none in return. He cut firewood for a winter at a sawmill outside of Buffalo and fixed barbed wire fence for a long summer for a cattle outfit south of Gillette, and worked one autumn pulling potatoes for a Mennonite family near Sheridan, who paid him in cash and warm meals and asked him only whether the dog was a biter, and were satisfied when he said the dog was a biter only of the unkind. Tenny grew older. The dense black and tan coat went gray at the muzzle, and the alert amber eyes took longer to track movement, and the slight limp from the old barbed wire scar on his left flank deepened into a steady favoring of his right hindquarter. He was 8 years old now, and he had the bearing of a working dog who had already done all the work that any one dog could be reasonably asked to do, and he did the rest of it anyway, because he loved the man at the other end of the leash that was no longer ever a leash. The 4th winter, after the white farmhouse, Cassian wintered at a small logging camp tucked into a draw east of the Bighorns, where the foreman, a gruff-bearded man named Hollister Meade, who ran the place hard but fair, had let Cassian convert a corner of the old saw shed into a sleeping space, and in exchange, Cassian sharpened the chains and split the kindling, and watched the camp at night when the men were down in town, and the dog slept by the cast-iron stove in the foreman's office, and the foreman did not charge Cassian rent because he said the dog earned his keep just by being a dog who looked the way that dog looked at the door. The camp had a wood stove and a single wall lantern and a stack of paperbacks left behind by previous winter caretakers, and Cassian read by the lantern in the long, blue-cold evenings, and Tenny lay across his boots with his gray muzzle on his paws, and the snow piled up against the tin walls of the saw shed in slow, patient layers. He was reading a battered paperback western on a Tuesday night in late January when the foreman knocked on the door of the saw shed and called his name. "Bridger. Got a woman here looking for you. Says she's a lawyer." Cassian sat very still on the bunk for a long second with the paperback open across his knee. He set the book aside very carefully. He stood up and ran one rough, calloused hand once across the dense gray coat at Tenny's shoulder, and Tenny stood up too because the dog had learned long ago to stand when the man stood. They walked across the lantern-lit snowy yard from the saw shed to the foreman's office. And the foreman's office was a small log room with a cast-iron stove and a desk, and a single, straight-backed wooden chair, and on the chair sat a woman of about 34, with auburn shoulder-length waves and hazel eyes and pale, freckled skin, and a small silver locket at the throat of a cream blouse, dressed in a charcoal pantsuit gone wet at the knees from the snow, with a leather briefcase open across her lap and a manila folder in her trembling, thin fingers. Cassian stopped in the doorway. The foreman went out and shut the door behind him. Tenny crossed to the wood stove and lay down. The woman stood up, and the manila folder shook in her trembling, thin fingers. She said, "Mr. Bridger." He said, "Ma'am." She said, "My name is Adelaide Whitcomb." He went very still in a way he had not gone still in 7 winters. He said, "Ma'am." She said, "My father was Earl Whitcomb." He said, "Ma'am, he pulled through that night." She said, "Mr. Bridger, he pulled through that night and 752 nights after it." He said, "Ma'am." She said, "He died last March, very peacefully, in the back bedroom of the white farmhouse where you laid him down." The room was very quiet. The cast-iron stove ticked. Tenny lifted his gray muzzle and looked at the woman and laid his head back down. Cassian felt himself sit down without remembering having decided to. He sat on the edge of the foreman's desk and laid his rough, calloused hands flat on his knees and looked at his hands for a long time. He said, "Ma'am, I'm glad," she said, "Mr. Bridger." He said, "Ma'am, I'm glad I knew that." She said, "I have been looking for you for 9 months." He said, "Ma'am, I am sorry to have made you look." She said, "Mr. Bridger, please listen." He said, "Ma'am." She said, "My father took a photograph of a paper diner napkin with your name on it the morning after he woke up in the back bedroom, and he kept that photograph in the drawer of the bedside table, and he kept the napkin folded in the inside pocket of his brown corduroy coat for the next 2 years and 1 month, and when he died, he left a will that named you. He said, 'Ma'am,' she said, 'you were named in his will, Mr. Bridger.' He said, 'Ma'am, I have no claim.' She said, 'Mr. Bridger.' He said, 'Ma'am, what a man does for another man on a cold road is the doing of it, not the getting paid for it. There is no claim.' She said, 'Mr. Bridger, please, I am asking you to come with me. I'm asking you to come and look at what he wanted you to have. I'm not asking you to take a thing if you do not want it. I'm asking you to come and look.'" Cassian was silent a long while. He looked at Tenny on the rag rug by the cast-iron stove. He said, "Ma'am." She said, "Sir." He said, "Will the dog come?" She said, "The dog is welcome." He said, "When?" She said, "Tonight, if you can." He said, "Ma'am, I can." He gathered the paperback and the lantern and the bedroll from the corner of the saw shed, and he laid the foreman's spare key on the desk with a folded note thanking him for the winter, and he climbed up into the passenger seat of Adelaide Whitcomb's gray 4-door sedan with the chains on the tires for the snow, and Tenny climbed up into the back seat behind him with the slow, careful, arthritic deliberateness of a dog who had begun to feel his 8 years in earnest, and the dog laid his gray muzzle on the seat back behind Adelaide's right shoulder and breathed his long, slow, warm breaths against the auburn waves of her hair. They drove south out of the logging camp in the dark, and the headlights pushed 2 narrow tunnels through the falling snow, and for the first hour neither of them spoke. Then, somewhere on the long curve of Highway 14 west of Graybull, Adelaide said, very quietly, "Mr. Bridger." He said, "Ma'am?" She said, "My father and I had not spoken in 11 years. The dashboard glow lit the side of her face green. He said, "Ma'am." She said, "My mother died when I was 19, and my father went into himself the way a hand goes into a glove. And he did not come back out, and I told him things I'm not proud of, and he told me things he was not proud of, and I left. And I went to law school in Denver, and I built a life, and I told myself for 11 years that I was not the one who needed to make the first call." He said, "Ma'am?" She said, "On the morning after a stranger and a dog laid my father in the back bedroom of his own house, he picked up the telephone for the first time in 11 years, and he called my office in Denver, and he left a message with my receptionist, and the message said, 'Adelaide, a man and his dog brought me home. Tell my daughter when she has time that her father has remembered how to keep his door open.'" Cassian looked out the passenger window at the snow falling sideways in the headlights. He did not speak for a long time. Adelaide kept her hazel eyes on the road. She said, "I called him back the next afternoon. We talked for 40 minutes. We talked the next afternoon for an hour. We talked every Sunday afternoon for the next 2 years and 1 month. I came up in May, and again in July, and again at Thanksgiving, and again at Christmas, and again in March, when he was dying. I held his hand. He said, 'Ma'am.' She said, 'Mr. Bridger, my father told me about you on the second telephone call. He said the door he had not been able to open by himself for 11 years had been opened from the outside by a stranger and a dog, and that whatever he had left, when he was done with it, was going to belong to you.' Cassian said, 'Ma'am, he had you.' Adelaide said, 'He had me at the end. He had me because of you.' They drove the rest of the long curve through the falling snow, and the headlights pushed their narrow tunnels through the dark, and Tenny breathed his long, slow, warm breaths against the auburn waves of Adelaide's hair, and Cassian Bridger sat in the passenger seat with his rough, calloused hands folded on his knees and watched the snow come down. They did not stop in Graybull. They did not stop in Cody. They did not stop, in fact, until they had come up into the painted rock drainage and the road curved north past the old pump station, and Adelaide pulled the gray sedan into a turnout above the bowl, and she cut the engine, and she turned in the driver's seat, and she said, "Mr. Bridger." He said, "Ma'am." She said, "Before we go down, you should know what you are looking at." He said, "Ma'am." She said, "My father was not a poor man." He said, "Ma'am." She said, "My grandfather bought the lower hayfields and the windbreak in 1946 with money he had brought home from the war, and he added the upper bowl in 1953, and the mineral rights on the southwest quarter were leased to a small operator out of Casper in 1981, and the lease has paid a quarterly royalty into a Whitcomb account at the Painted Rock State Bank every quarter for 38 years. And my father did not touch a dollar of it for the last 20 of those years because he had no one to spend it on." He said, "Ma'am." She said, "The place you are looking at is 240 acres of paid hayland and pasture, a working barn, a grain silo, a hay shed, a tractor that runs and a tractor that does not, a small herd of 14 mother cows and 1 breeding bull he leased back to a neighbor, a water right out of the South Fork of Crow Creek that has been on the books since 1896, and a savings account, after probate and taxes, of approximately $341,000. He said, "Ma'am." She said, "He left it all to you, with one condition." He said, "Ma'am." She said, "The condition is that you keep the doors of the white farmhouse open to any man or woman who has come home from a war and forgotten how to be home, and that you feed them, and that you put them up, and that you let them stay as long as they need to stay, and that you do not charge them a dollar for any of it." He said, "Ma'am." She said, "The condition is in writing, signed and notarized. It is not a thing I am asking. It is a thing my father asked." He said, "Ma'am." She said, "Mr. Bridger." He said, "Ma'am." She said, "Will you come down?" Cassian Bridger looked through the windshield down the long slope into the bowl, and at the far end of the bowl, set against the windbreak of cottonwoods, stood the crooked white farmhouse painted in the color of an old tooth. and a thin, steady ribbon of wood smoke rose from the stovepipe into the cold, blue evening air. And the red barn leaned its familiar lean against the wind, and the weathered grain silo stood its weathered watch, and the long, curving gravel drive ran out to the rural mailbox on the Painted Rock Road, and on the porch of the white farmhouse, very small at this distance, two figures stood waiting. He said, "Ma'am, who is on the porch?" Adelaide said, "The pastor from the Painted Rock Church and his wife. They have kept the stove going in the parlor since I left for Denver this morning, because I asked them to, because I did not know whether I would find you in time, and I did not want the house to be cold when I brought you home." Cassian said, "Ma'am." Adelaide said, "Mr. Bridger, will you come down?" He said, "Ma'am, I will come down." She started the gray sedan and put it into gear, and they came down the long, curving drive in the cold, blue evening. And Tenny stood up in the back seat and pressed his gray muzzle against the rear passenger window and breathed warm fog onto the cold glass. And the white farmhouse grew larger and larger against the windbreak of cottonwoods. And the two figures on the porch grew larger, too. And Cassian Bridger sat in the passenger seat with his rough, calloused hands folded on his knees, and his steel-gray eyes very steady on the place that 8 winters ago, and 3 days of walking, he had carried a dying stranger home to. The gray sedan rolled to a stop at the foot of the porch steps. Adelaide cut the engine. Cassian sat very still. Tenny breathed his long, slow, warm breath against the cold glass of the rear window. On the porch, in the soft yellow glow of a lantern hung from a hook beside the door, stood a thin man of about 64 with salt and pepper hair combed neatly back from a high forehead, wire-rimmed silver glasses, kind blue eyes, a brown tweed jacket buttoned over a white clerical shirt, and a small cross of polished walnut hung on a leather cord at his throat. Beside him stood a small, soft-faced woman of about the same age, with white hair pulled back into a low knot, a long charcoal wool coat buttoned to the chin, a deep red scarf, and her gloved hands folded against her belly the way women fold their hands when they have spent a long afternoon waiting and praying and have run out of other things to do. They came down the porch steps together as Adelaide and Cassian climbed out of the sedan, and the pastor extended his right hand and said, "Son, Pastor Ezra Holloway of the Painted Rock Church, and this is my wife Marigold, and we have been keeping your stove going since just past noon." Cassian shook the offered hand. He did not trust himself to speak. The pastor's wife laid her gloved hand on Cassian's forearm and said, "Son, come inside and get warm." Tenny climbed slowly down out of the back seat with the arthritic deliberateness of his 8 years, and the pastor's wife saw the dog's gray muzzle and his slight limp on the right hindquarter, and her eyes went wet, and she crouched right there in the snow at the foot of the porch and held out her gloved hand. And Tenny crossed to her with the steady working dignity of a working dog and laid his black and tan head against her palm. And the pastor's wife said, "Oh, sweet boy. Oh, you sweet boy." They climbed the 3 weathered porch steps together. The front door opened on warm, yellow lamplight and the smell of wood smoke and cedar, and the parlor was just as Cassian remembered it from 8 winters and 3 days of walking ago. And the wing-back chair stood by the cast-iron wood stove, and the faded patchwork quilt lay folded across its back, and on the side table beside the chair sat a framed paper diner napkin under glass, with a single line in plain block capitals that said, "Cassian Bridger," and beside the framed napkin, on a small square of black velvet under a second glass dome, lay a tin button, worn smooth at the edges with the faint impression of an eagle on its face. Cassian stood in the middle of the parlor with his rough, calloused hands hanging at his sides, and he looked at the framed napkin and the tin button under glass, and he did not speak. Adelaide stepped up beside him. She said, "My father had it framed the spring after you left. He said it was the one thing in the house he never wanted to lose." Cassian still did not speak. Pastor Ezra Holloway laid a hand gently on his shoulder and led him to the wingback chair and eased him into it. and the pastor's wife brought a tin mug of coffee from the wood stove and pressed it into his hands, and Tenny lay down on the rag rug at the foot of the chair, just as he had lain on the rag rug by the back bedroom bed 8 winters ago. Adelaide knelt by the chair with the manila folder open on her knees, and she read aloud, slowly, the relevant lines of her father's last will and testament, stripped of their legal language, and the lines were these: "To the man who carried me home in October of 2018, whose name is folded in my coat pocket, I leave the Whitcomb place in its entirety, with one condition. The condition is that he keep the doors open to those who have come home from a war and have forgotten how to be home. The condition is that he feed them and put them up and not charge them $1. The condition is that he understand in time that he is one of them, and that the door he is keeping open is the door he himself was let in through, by a stranger and a dog, on a cold October afternoon." The parlor was very quiet. The cast-iron wood stove ticked. Cassian set the tin mug of coffee down on the side table very carefully beside the framed napkin. He laid his rough, calloused hand across the dense gray and tan coat at Tenny's shoulder, and Tenny looked up at him with one amber eye and laid his gray muzzle back down on his paws. Cassian closed his steel-gray eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, they were wet, and he did not try to wipe them. He said, "Ma'am." Adelaide said, "Mr. Bridger." He said, "Ma'am, your father was the first man I ever met whose hand on my wrist was a promise, instead of a hold." Adelaide said, "Mr. Bridger." He said, "Ma'am, I will keep the door open." The pastor's wife pressed her own hand against her mouth, and her eyes went wet. The pastor laid his hand again on Cassian's shoulder, and he said, "Son, may we pray?" Cassian said, "Sir, please." They bowed their heads in the warm yellow lamplight of the parlor of the white farmhouse, and Pastor Ezra Holloway lifted his quiet, steady voice, the way men in country churches have lifted their quiet, steady voices for 200 years. And he said, "Lord, you who walked the long road yourself, who know the cold and the hunger and the kindness of strangers, we thank you for the door that opened tonight, and for the man who walked through it, and for the man who first set it open by lying down in a ditch beside a fence post on a cold October afternoon and trusting that somebody would come, and for the dog who has carried more than any dog should be asked to carry. And we ask you, Lord, in the name of your Son, who took the long road too, that you bless this house and the keeping of its door, and that you bring up the slope the men and women who need to come up it, and that you give this man the strength to feed them and the wisdom to know when to speak and when to be silent. And we ask, Lord, that the rest of his road be steadier than the road he has walked already, and that he understand, before he is done, that he was loved long before he carried anyone home, and that he is loved still. Amen. Cassian opened his steel-gray eyes. He said, "Amen." Tenny exhaled a long, warm breath against the rag rug. The pastor's wife pressed her gloved hand to her mouth and wept silently. Adelaide laid her hand on Cassian's forearm and squeezed once, very gently. Outside the window of the parlor, the cold blue evening had turned all the way to true dark, and the first hard stars of the high country had begun to prick through the cottonwoods, and the wind out of the bowl had dropped to a steady whisper through the windbreak. The first man came up the slope on the 3rd Tuesday of the following May, a young Marine who had walked off a Veterans Affairs ward in Sheridan with no plan, and a bedroll and a paperback in his coat pocket, and Cassian Bridger met him at the porch steps with a tin mug of coffee and a folded patchwork quilt, and a steady, unhurried, no questions welcome that was the only welcome the man had ever been given that did not arrive with conditions, and the man sat in the wing-back chair by the wood stove and did not speak for 2 days, and on the 3rd day he spoke, and on the 4th day he wept, and on the 3rd Tuesday of the following August he walked back down the long, curving gravel drive with his shoulders set and a kind of weight gone from his eyes and he hugged Cassian on the porch, and he hugged the dog on the rag rug, and he walked out to the rural mailbox at the Painted Rock Road, and he did not look back. The second came in June. The third came in late August. There were 11 by the end of that first year, and 23 by the end of the second, and 37 by the end of the third. And Cassian Bridger learned slowly, in the long, unhurried way that broken men learn the things they have most needed to know, that the door he was keeping open had been kept open for him long before he had ever known a door was a thing that could be open at all. Tenny lived another 2 years and 3 months. He died very peacefully on the rag rug by the back bedroom bed on a warm afternoon in late September, with the windows open onto the bowl and the smell of cut hay coming in through the screen, and Cassian sat on the floor beside him with one rough, calloused hand laid across the dense gray coat at the dog's shoulder, and he was there when the long, warm breath went out for the last time and did not come back in. They buried Tenny under the windbreak of cottonwoods, in a place where the first sun of the morning falls on the hayfield bowl, and Cassian set a flat creek stone over the grave and carved one word into it with a chisel from the barn, and the word was loyal. Adelaide came up from Denver 4 times that first year and 7 times the next, and she met every man and woman who came up the slope, and she handled the small, steady stream of paperwork that came with running a place that had become a thing more than a place. And on the spring of the 4th year, she gave up her practice in Denver and moved into the upstairs back bedroom of the white farmhouse, and hung her shingle in the front parlor. And the upstairs back bedroom became her bedroom, and the upstairs front bedroom became her office. And the pastor's wife came every Wednesday afternoon to help with the cooking, and the pastor came every Sunday morning to lead a small, unhurried prayer in the front parlor, and the door of the white farmhouse stayed open, and the long, curving gravel drive bore its slow, steady traffic of broken people, coming up and steadier people going down, and the windbreak of cottonwood shifted in the wind, and the smoke from the stovepipe rose its thin, steady ribbon into the cold, blue evenings of one Wyoming winter after another, and the framed napkin and the tin button stayed under their 2 glass domes on the side table beside the wingback chair, and the wingback chair stayed by the wood stove. And Cassian Bridger, the man who had once walked the gravel shoulder of Highway 14 in October with $11 folded into his right boot, sat in that wingback chair on the long, quiet evenings when the last visitor had gone to bed, and he laid his rough, calloused hand on the place on the rag rug where a black and tan, gray-muzzled dog had once laid his head down, and he was, in the end, home. The door is still open. If you are walking a cold road tonight, and the wind is in your bones, and the $11 you have left are folded into the lining of your right boot, the slope-up out of the bowl is steady, and the lantern on the porch is lit, and the wingback chair is empty for you, and the coffee is on the wood stove, and the door is open. It has been open since October of 2018. When a man who had nothing left lifted a man with less than nothing onto his shoulder beside a fence post on the gravel turnout of Highway 14, and walked. May the doors that have been opened for you stay open, friends. May the doors you have it in you to open stay open also. Amen.